Nuclear energy has had a strange year. For a long time, it was the part of the energy world that nobody wanted to talk about. Now, all of a sudden, it's one of the most talked about corners of the stock market. So today I want to walk you through why that happened, what's actually driving it, which companies keep coming up in that conversation, and what the real risks are, because there are real risks, and I'm not going to pretend there aren't. Before I go further, here's the disclaimer, and I mean every word of it. This video is for education only. It is not financial advice. I am not telling you to buy anything. Always do your own research, and if you're not sure, talk to a licensed financial advisor who actually knows your situation. I don't. Let's start with the simple question: why is nuclear energy back in the news? It comes down to one word: power. Not political power, electricity. The world is using more electricity than it has ever used before, and that demand is growing faster than almost anyone expected even 5 years ago. Part of that is normal stuff: more people, more electric cars, more air conditioning as the planet warms. But the big new piece is data centers. Specifically, the data centers that run artificial intelligence. Here's a number that surprised a lot of people in the industry. A single large AI data center can use as much electricity as a small city. Not a town, a city. Some of the newer ones being built use more power than entire countries used just a couple decades ago. And here's the problem for the companies building these data centers. Wind and solar are great, but they don't run all the time. The wind doesn't always blow. The sun goes down every single night. A data center can't go down at night. It has to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every single day of the year. That's where nuclear comes back in. A nuclear plant runs around the clock. It doesn't care if it's cloudy. It doesn't care if it's midnight. It just keeps producing power hour after hour, day after day. So companies like Microsoft, Amazon, and Google, the companies running the biggest AI data centers in the world, have started signing deals directly with nuclear power plants and nuclear companies. Not someday, right now. Some of these deals are already public record. That's the real story. It's not a secret. It's not a hidden truth nobody noticed. It's been written about in major financial newspapers for the past 2 years. What's changed is that more everyday investors are starting to pay attention to it. Now let's talk about history for a second, because history actually helps explain where we are. Back in the 1970s, nuclear power was the future. Dozens of plants were being built across the United States. Then in 1979, there was a partial meltdown at a plant called 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. Nobody died from radiation exposure there, but the fear it created changed everything. Plant construction slowed to a crawl. A few years later, in 1986, the much more serious disaster at Chernobyl in the Soviet Union made that fear permanent in a lot of people's minds. For almost 40 years after that, building new nuclear plants in most of the world was incredibly rare. That's important context because it explains why nuclear stocks have been quiet for so long. The industry basically went into a long sleep. Old plants kept running, almost no new ones got built, and then slowly, starting around 2020, things began to change. Why 2020? A few reasons. Climate goals pushed countries to look for power sources that don't burn fossil fuels but also don't depend on the weather. Energy security became a bigger worry after conflicts disrupted oil and gas supplies in Europe. And then, layered right on top of that, came the AI boom and its enormous appetite for electricity. So you've got 3 separate forces: climate policy, energy security, and AI, all pointing in the same direction at the same time. That's unusual. And that's a big part of why nuclear has gone from forgotten to fashionable in the investing world. Now let's talk about the actual companies people are looking at. I'm going to walk through a handful of names that come up again and again in this conversation. I am not telling you to buy any of them. I'm explaining why they're part of the conversation. First, the uranium miners. Nuclear plants need fuel, and that fuel is uranium. Companies that mine uranium out of the ground are some of the most direct ways investors play this trend. Cameco, based in Canada, is one of the largest uranium producers in the world and a name that comes up constantly. There's also Constellation Energy, a US company involved in enriching uranium. That's the process of turning raw uranium into fuel that's actually usable in a reactor. Second, the reactor builders and plant operators. Constellation Energy is the largest operator of nuclear power plants in the United States, and it's the company that signed one of the most talked about AI power deals, agreeing to restart a shutdown reactor specifically to power a tech company's data centers. There's also Vistra, which runs a mix of power plants including nuclear, and has become a favorite among investors betting on rising electricity demand generally. Third, the new technology companies, the ones working on something called small modular reactors or SMRs. These are smaller factory-built nuclear reactors that companies hope can be built faster and cheaper than the giant plants of the past. NuScale Power is one name in this space. Oklo is another, and it's gotten attention partly because it has backing connected to well-known tech investors. These are much earlier stage, much riskier companies than the big established utilities. They're closer to a bet on the future than a bet on something already working today. Fourth, the diversified energy and industrial names that touch nuclear without being purely a nuclear company. GE Vernova, which makes turbines and other power equipment, fits here. So does Cameco's larger international peer, Kazatomprom, based in Kazakhstan, which is actually the largest uranium producer in the world by volume. I'm not going to sit here and tell you these are the 9 winners. Nobody knows which specific companies will win. What I can tell you is that these names represent different ways people are approaching the same basic idea: more electricity demand, more interest in nuclear power, more government support for the industry than it's had in decades. Now let's slow down and talk about 2 simple tools that can help you think about a sector like this, whether it's nuclear or anything else. The first tool is something called diversification. It's a fancy word, but the idea is simple. Don't put all your money into one single company chasing one single trend. Think of it like a bridge. A bridge with one support beam can hold weight for a while, but if that one beam cracks, the whole bridge comes down. A bridge with 10 beams can lose 1 or 2 and still stand. If you're interested in nuclear energy as a trend, spreading interest across several companies, or using a fund that holds many of them at once, is generally less risky than betting everything on one single stock you read about online. The second tool is something called time horizon. That just means asking yourself, how long can I leave this money alone? Nuclear power plants take years, sometimes a decade or more to build. The payoff from this trend, if it comes, is not likely to happen in a few weeks or a few months. It's a slower story. If you need this money back next year for a roof repair or a medical bill, a slow-moving, long-term sector like this may not be the right fit for that money at all. Let's go back to the 2008 financial crisis for a minute, because it teaches a related lesson, even though it's a totally different industry. In the years leading up to 2008, a lot of regular investors piled into housing-related investments because home prices had been going up for so long that people assumed they always would. When that assumption broke, a lot of people who had put too much money into one idea with money they couldn't afford to lose got hurt badly. I'm not saying nuclear stocks are heading for a crash like that. I'm saying the lesson about not betting the whole house on one trend, with money you can't afford to lose, applies just as much to a hot sector like nuclear power today as it did to housing back then. Now some of you watching this are thinking, Mark, isn't this just another overhyped trend, like a lot of stocks that get talked about online and then crash back down? That's a completely fair question, and I want to address it directly instead of pretending it doesn't matter. It's true that any sector that gets a lot of attention can get ahead of itself. When a lot of people are excited about the same idea at the same time, prices can rise faster than the actual businesses are improving. That happened with a lot of stocks during the dot-com years around 1999 and 2000, when investors poured money into internet companies that had exciting stories but very little actual profit. Some of those companies turned out to be real and valuable for decades. A lot of others disappeared completely. So the counter-argument is real. Some nuclear-related stocks today may be more hype than substance, especially the smaller, earlier-stage companies. The honest answer is that nobody can promise you which ones will turn out like the survivors of the dot-com era and which ones will turn out like the ones that vanished. That uncertainty is part of investing in any growing trend, and it's exactly why the next part of this video matters. Let me give you two specific examples from recent years, so this doesn't stay abstract. In September of 2024, Constellation Energy announced a deal to restart the 3 Mile Island plant I mentioned earlier, the same plant from the 1979 incident, though a different, undamaged reactor unit on that same site that had simply been shut down for economic reasons back in 2019. The plan is to bring it back online specifically to provide power for a tech company's data centers, under a deal reportedly worth around $16 billion over 20 years. When that announcement came out, Constellation's stock jumped sharply in a single day. That's a real example of how directly the AI power story has connected to a specific nuclear company's stock price. Second example, Oklo, the small modular reactor company I mentioned earlier, went public in 2024 through a process called a SPAC merger, which is a faster path to going public than a traditional stock offering. As of mid-2026, Oklo doesn't have a single operating commercial reactor generating revenue yet. It's still a development stage company. But its stock has at times traded at a value of several $billion, purely on the promise of what it might build in the future. That gap, a company worth billions of dollars on paper, with no operating product yet, is exactly the kind of thing that makes this sector exciting to some investors and frightening to others. Two real examples: one established company with an actual operating plant and a signed contract. One early-stage company valued mostly on hope and future potential. That difference matters a lot if you're trying to understand the risk you'd actually be taking on with any specific name in this space. So let's get to three plain, simple things you can actually do with all of this, if this topic interests you. First, separate the established companies from the speculative ones in your own head before you do anything else. A company like Constellation, which already operates dozens of nuclear plants and already has signed contracts bringing in real money, is a fundamentally different kind of investment than a company like Oklo or NuScale, which is mostly a bet on a technology that hasn't proven itself commercially yet. Know which type of company you're actually looking at. Second, if you're interested in the trend but don't want to pick individual winners, look into funds that hold a broad basket of nuclear and uranium-related companies instead of a single stock. There are exchange-traded funds built specifically around this theme. A fund spreads your risk across many companies at once, so one bad pick doesn't sink your entire position. Third, decide in advance how much of your overall savings you're comfortable putting toward any single emerging trend, nuclear or otherwise, and write that number down before you act, not after you're already excited. A common approach a lot of financial professionals suggest is keeping speculative, trend-based positions to a small slice of your overall portfolio, with the bulk of your savings kept in more diversified, long-established investments. The exact number is a personal decision, and it depends on your age, your other savings, and how soon you'll need the money, which is exactly why this isn't something I can decide for you in a video. If this video helped you think a little more clearly about how to look at a hot sector like this one, I'd genuinely appreciate it if you'd consider subscribing. I've also covered the Federal Reserve's recent rate decisions and what they mean for savers, and before that, a video on how Social Security timing decisions actually work. And this nuclear energy story connects to both of those, because all three come back to the same root question: How do you make calm, informed decisions with your money in a world that's changing fast? I'd rather you hear the honest version of a story like this from someone trying to lay out the facts than from someone trying to sell you excitement. One question for the comments: when you hear AI is driving a nuclear energy boom, does that change how you think about your own savings, or does it feel too far removed from your day-to-day life to matter? I'd like to know honestly.